Welcome to our deep dive today into the U.S. Constitution. Get ready, because we're about to uncover how a document born from compromise has managed to adapt and remain relevant in a constantly changing world. Buckle up, because it's going to be a wild ride. Did you know the Constitution was almost a complete do-over?
Yeah, the Founding Fathers initially gathered in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. They thought they just needed a few tweaks. Instead, they ended up creating a whole new system of government.
The Articles of Confederation, they were struggling, right?
Yeah.
What exactly went wrong?
Imagine a government that can't collect taxes, regulate trade, or even raise an army effectively. That was the reality under the Articles.
Wow.
Spain had closed off trade through New Orleans. Pirates were seizing American ships.
Oh, no.
And states were ignoring treaties and acting like independent countries. It was pure chaos.
This wasn't just a few cracks in the foundation. The whole system was crumbling. Wasn't there a rebellion? That truly exposed the weakness of the Articles.
Exactly. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 was a major wake-up call. Farmers in Massachusetts were facing debt and foreclosure, so they revolted. The state desperately pleaded with the Confederation Congress for help, but they were utterly powerless to intervene. It became glaringly obvious that something had to change.
And that led to the famous Constitutional Convention, but it was supposed to be a revision session, not a complete rewrite.
That's right. The initial goal was to amend the Articles, but as brilliant minds like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Benjamin Franklin gathered in Philadelphia, they realized the issues ran far deeper. They needed a new foundation for a stronger, more unified nation. And so the U.S. Constitution was born.
Creating a government from scratch, talk about pressure. I bet there were some fiery debates and tough compromises. What were some of the major sticking points?
Well, for starters, the larger states favored the Virginia Plan, which proposed representation based on population.
Okay.
Naturally, the smaller states preferred the New Jersey Plan, which advocated for equal representation for every state, regardless of size. It was a classic power struggle.
Deadlock. How did they ever find a way out of that maze?
Enter the Connecticut Compromise. Brilliantly resolving the representation debate, it created a bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives based on population, and the Senate with equal representation for each state. This ingenious solution broke the gridlock. It's fascinating how this compromise still shapes the power dynamics of Congress and even the Electoral College today.
It's a reminder that those early decisions still echo through the centuries. But there was another major issue they had to confront, right? One that would cast a long shadow on American history.
Of course. We can't ignore the elephant in the room, slavery.
Yeah.
Northern states were moving towards abolition, while southern states, deeply reliant on enslaved labor, fought fiercely to protect it. The tension was palpable.
That must have been an incredibly difficult and morally charged debate. How did they attempt to resolve such a divisive issue?
Sadly, through the deeply flawed 3/5 compromise. Each enslaved person was counted as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation. This compromise reflected the moral complexities of the era and has had a lasting impact on the nation's history and the continued struggle for racial equality.
It's a stark reminder that compromises, even those intended to unify, can carry a heavy burden. But okay, once the Constitution was drafted, did everyone happily sign on?
Not exactly. Next came the hurdle of ratification. 9 out of 13 states needed to approve the Constitution, bypassing the unanimous requirement of the Articles of Confederation.
So it was a state-by-state campaign to win over hearts and minds. Who were the key players in this ratification battle?
You had the Federalists, who championed the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, who opposed it, fearing a strong central government might trample individual liberties.
Okay.
The Federalists were savvy, sensing the Anti-Federalists had a strong hold in state legislatures. They took their case directly to the people through ratifying conventions.
That's brilliant. Go around the potentially hostile legislatures and appeal directly to the voters. Did this strategy work? Were there any other key turning points in the ratification process?
It did, but it wasn't easy. The Federalists launched a sophisticated campaign. They published essays, like the famous Federalist Papers. They held rallies and debates. But one thing truly tipped the scales in their favor: the promise of a Bill of Rights.
Ah, yes. Those essential guarantees of individual freedoms. Were the Anti-Federalists demanding a Bill of Rights from the start?
Absolutely. Many feared the Constitution, as written, gave the federal government too much power and lacked explicit protections for individual liberties. The Federalists recognized this concern and strategically promised to add a Bill of Rights if the Constitution was ratified.
A masterful political maneuver. Did this finally persuade enough states to ratify?
Yes. the promise of a Bill of Rights was a game changer. States like Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, initially hesitant, finally came on board. By July 1788, 9 states had ratified, and the U.S. Constitution became the law of the land.
Victory. But as you mentioned earlier, this was just the beginning. The Constitution's ability to adapt is arguably its most amazing feature. And to understand that, we need to delve into the world of amendments.
Absolutely. Stay tuned as we uncover how this document, drafted over 200 years ago, continues to evolve and shape the United States today.
Expert. All right, so we've got this amazing document, the Constitution, ratified and ready to go. But the story doesn't end there. It's actually designed to change and adapt.
Right.
Let's talk about amendments, those additions that have kept the Constitution relevant for centuries.
That's the genius of the Founding Fathers. They understood they couldn't predict every challenge the nation would face, so they built in a process for the Constitution to evolve, a way to make those necessary tweaks without needing to start over every few decades.
That's some serious foresight. So 27 amendments so far. What does this process actually look like in action? How does an idea become part of the Constitution?
It's a two-step process. First, an amendment needs to be proposed, either by a 2/3 majority vote in both houses of Congress, or by a national convention, called for by 2/3 of the state legislatures.
Okay, so that gets the ball rolling, puts the idea out there. What's next?
Then comes ratification. 3/4 of the states have to give their thumbs up to the proposed amendment. They can do this through their legislatures or through special state conventions. It's a high bar to clear, and intentionally so. You don't want to be constantly changing the Constitution on a whim.
Makes sense you want stability, but also the ability to adapt. Now, I'm curious, have there been any proposed amendments? That didn't make it through this whole process. I mean, there must be tons of ideas floating around Congress.
You're right, not every proposal gets enshrined in the Constitution. In fact, there are 4 amendments that are still pending. They've been proposed by Congress, but haven't yet been ratified by 3/4 of the states.
4 amendments in limbo. That's wild. What are some of these proposals that never quite crossed the finish line?
One of the most intriguing is the Congressional Apportionment Amendment, proposed way back in 1789. It aimed to set a clear formula for determining the size of the House of Representatives. It's fascinating to think about the political and social forces that might have prevented its ratification for all these years.
Wow, stalled since 1789. What about more recent examples?
The Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, is another one with a compelling story. It aimed to guarantee equal legal rights for all Americans, regardless of sex. It garnered significant support and reached 35 states, but fell short of the 38 needed for ratification.
Didn't a few more states ratify the ERA recently? What does that mean for its status?
Yes, in recent years. 3 more states have ratified the ERA, rekindling the debate about its validity. This raises complex questions about whether ratifications after a deadline are legitimate, and whether the ERA could still become part of the Constitution.
It sounds like the ERA's fate is still hanging in the balance. So you have these intriguing examples of pending amendments. Have there been any that actually expired, missing their chance to become part of the Constitution?
Yes, 2 amendments actually had deadlines and ultimately expired. One focused on voting rights in Washington, D.C., while the other aimed to prohibit denying any U.S. citizen the right to vote based on sex.
Didn't we already cover that with the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote?
You're sharp. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, did guarantee women the right to vote. However, this proposed amendment sought to expand on that, explicitly prohibiting any form of sex discrimination in voting rights.
So even seemingly settled issues can reemerge, prompting new attempts to refine the Constitution. But there's one aspect we haven't touched on yet that I find particularly fascinating: judicial review. It's this immense power held by the courts. But it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution.
Yes, judicial review. The power of the courts to declare laws or government actions unconstitutional. It's a cornerstone of our legal system. And yet, it's not directly spelled out in the Constitution.
So how did the courts acquire this incredible power? Did they just declare themselves the guardians of the Constitution?
It's a fascinating story of precedent. The landmark case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803 established the principle of judicial review.
Some might argue that giving the court this power, especially when it's not specifically granted in the Constitution, seems like a bit of a power grab. How do you see the court balancing its responsibility to interpret the Constitution with respecting the roles of the other branches of government?
It's a delicate dance for sure. It's important to remember that the early Supreme Court justices were deeply involved in framing the Constitution. They saw themselves as its protectors, tasked with ensuring that laws passed by Congress and actions taken by the president align with his principles.
So they were both the architects and the guardians of this new system of government. But this power of judicial review, while significant, isn't limitless, right? There must be checks on the court's authority.
Absolutely. The court exercises self-restraint and recognizes the importance of not overstepping its bounds. It avoids wading into political disputes or second-guessing policy decisions made by the elected branches of government.
So there are areas where the court treads lightly, deferring to the expertise of the other branches.
Precisely. For example, when it comes to foreign policy or national security, the court generally takes a hands-off approach, acknowledging the executive branch's specialized knowledge in these areas.
It's like a carefully choreographed dance between the different branches of government, each playing its part in upholding the Constitution. And speaking of the Constitution's reach, we can't overlook its global influence.
The U.S. Constitution has been a model for countless countries around the world. Its core principles, separation of powers, checks and balances, protection of individual liberties, have been incorporated into constitutions on every continent.
It's amazing to think about how those ideas, born in Philadelphia over 2 centuries ago, have resonated across the globe. But let's be real, the Constitution also has its critics. It's been labeled as outdated and difficult to amend.
That's true. Some argue that the amendment process is too cumbersome, making it challenging to address modern problems. Others point to its historical flaws, like the acceptance of slavery and the initial limitations on voting rights.
It seems those early compromises, while necessary at the time, have left a legacy of challenges that we're still grappling with today.
Precisely. The Constitution is a product of its time, and it's been a continuous journey to live up to its own ideals.
Wow, it's been an incredible journey exploring the U.S. Constitution, its origins, the compromises, the triumphs, and even the shortcomings.
It's a document that continues to spark debate and discussion, even centuries after its creation.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just a dusty old document. It's a living, breathing framework for our nation.
It's a testament to the framers' vision, that they created a system that could evolve with the times.
Absolutely, and that brings me to a question that's been swirling in my mind throughout our deep dive.
I'm all ears.
Knowing what we now know about the Constitution, its history, strengths, weaknesses, what one amendment would you propose to address the challenges facing the nation today?
That's the million-dollar question. It would be tempting to offer a simple solution, a single amendment to fix everything.
Right, like a magic wand.
Exactly. The beauty and the challenge of the Constitution lies in its complexity. Any proposed amendment would need careful consideration, its potential consequences weighed. It would undoubtedly spark passionate debate and disagreements.
So no easy answers.
Not at all. But that's the essence of a healthy democracy, isn't it? This ongoing conversation, the striving for a more perfect union. That's what keeps the Constitution relevant and vibrant, even after all these years.
You've given me a lot to think about. And listener, I hope this deep dive has sparked your own curiosity about the U.S. Constitution. Don't let our conversation end here. Dive into those sources. Explore the amendments, the court cases, the debates.
It's an endless journey of discovery.
Exactly. Form your own opinions. Engage in thoughtful discussions. And remember, the Constitution is yours to understand, to interpret, and to help shape for generations to come.
It's a living document.
Yeah.
And we all have a role to play in its ongoing story.
Until next time, keep on learning and keep on diving deep.